Amongst the pantheon of role-playing games that have been created over the years, Final Fantasy has often been deemed a more accessible franchise. Even though there are plenty of super bosses to bring about a sense of heightened difficulty, the core path is often balanced without too much emphasis placed on grinding. That's not to say there aren't difficulty spikes, with numerous storyline bosses acting as tailored skill benchmarks. But some of these will be a step above the rest, and sometimes this notion will be enhanced because of an action taken by the player. This would see certain bosses transform from being regular cannon fodder to adversaries that had the potential to even rival the relative strength of some super bosses. Of course, when taking into consideration that they were nowhere near intended to be endgame content. It's for this reason that those who suffered due to their own actions would seldom forget the ferocity of the bosses they were forced to then face. And this will be doubly true if they were either pasted in record time or managed to squeeze through by the skin of their teeth, only to find out from a friend that they had accidentally made the boss much harder than it needed to be. Today, we're going to run through those exact bosses, with the caveat that we won't be discussing bosses that are made more difficult through purposeful modes such as New Game Plus or Arcade Mode, which featured in Final Fantasy XVI. So strap yourselves in as we delve into 7 boss fights you could accidentally make even harder, starting with a classic, the Soulcage from Final Fantasy IX. One of the more fun trends across the Final Fantasy series is that a lot of undead creatures can either be hurt or defeated outright by using curative items such as potions and Phoenix Downs. In Final Fantasy IX, this particular method could be used to defeat the Soulcage with relative ease, an interesting choice given the significance of the entity, as it was used to control and manipulate the flow of Gaian and Terran souls. That such a simple method of victory existed meant the Soulcage should have been a piece of cake. But if the player was unaware, this boss could still pose a fun challenge. This challenge would come via powerful abilities such as the notorious level 5 death, which would instant KO any character at a level divisible by 5, and Mustard Bomb, which could inflict the fatal heat status. However, it was also possible to antagonize the Soulcage, something that would increase the difficulty in significant fashion. This turn of events would happen should the player attack the Soulcage with fire. This would be a natural course of action, as the Soulcage was presumed to be made of wood, and enemies of this nature are often weak to fire elemental spells. Unfortunately, after being attacked by any fire-aligned elemental attack, the Soulcage would catch on fire and its strength would be increased. It would also start to use an ability called Fire Blades, which could deal upwards of 600 damage. This could have a devastating impact on the party, but it was possible to reverse the effect by attacking the Soulcage with ice elemental spells such as Blizzard. This would, however, make using Reflect a dangerous strategy, as Soulcage also had access to spells such as Fire. Final Fantasy III was filled with intriguing plot twists, but one of the most curious centered around the Cloud of Darkness. It was initially believed that Xande was the big bad, and this made narrative sense. But as the game started to reach its conclusion, Cloud of Darkness would be revealed as the true big bad, and then fought against in an unwinnable encounter. The final stretch of Final Fantasy III therefore focused on the Warriors of Light becoming strong enough to defeat Cloud of Darkness, but this could be made even harder depending on which actions were taken. After the initial loss, Cloud of Darkness would await in the World of Darkness for the final showdown. Upon scaling the Crystal Tower and entering the dungeon, Cloud of Darkness could then be found at the center as if to goad the player, and it would be possible to initiate the boss fight encounter right there and then. But doing so would be a huge mistake. Should this path be taken, Cloud of Darkness would be faced at full strength. As such, it would boast a near maximum defensive stat that would make it almost impervious to damage, and its particle beam would also be so powerful it would likely one-shot every member of the party. This meant facing off against Cloud of Darkness in such a manner was not recommended. Instead, the recommendation was to venture into the 4 corners of the World of Darkness. Here, players would find 4 difficult bosses guarding the Dark Crystals, and upon their defeat, a Warrior of Darkness would be freed. The Warrior of Darkness would then sacrifice themselves to weaken the Cloud of Darkness, enabling players to engage in a proper final battle, with the odds evened. Now, due to the turbulent development of Final Fantasy XIII, many planned ideas and content, including a boss fight against the Fal'Cie Titan, would ultimately be set aside. Much of this content would instead be released as part of Final Fantasy XIII-2, as the developers seized the opportunity to revive these discarded concepts. And perhaps the most notable of these would be Atlas, a boss who would bear a striking resemblance to the aforementioned cut boss, Titan, sharing near identical character models as well as a name connected to the same mythological origin. Atlas appeared in Episode 2 of the game, acting as the chapter's main boss. In preparation, the main objectives of the chapter would involve Serah and Noel exploring the ruins in search of a mysterious device that they could use to defeat Atlas, who was terrorizing the ruins. When the device was found and successfully manipulated, players would be able to battle Atlas in its weakened state for what should have been a fairly manageable boss encounter. However, players could also have the option to avoid using the device, and this would result in Atlas becoming a much more formidable boss. In its full-powered form, Atlas would boast 156,000 HP, 10 times more than in its weakened state. Its stagger point would also jump from 200% to 900%. And it would have greatly increased stats, as well as much higher resistances to fire, ice, and lightning elemental attacks. Due to when this boss was encountered, it was therefore recommended to weaken Atlas and then revisit the chapter later after getting much stronger. Should the player choose to not do so though, and fight Atlas powered up, the challenge would be much more severe. But if successful, it was also possible to see the paradox ending called a giant mistake. And this was because Atlas's harder form was meant as a challenge for those undergoing endgame content. But unwitting or bold players could end up biting off more than they could chew should they face it early. Final Fantasy VII has been revered for many years due to its revolutionary impact on role-playing games, as well as how it propagated the Final Fantasy franchise on a global scale. There were many aspects that helped to contribute to this, with Sephiroth serving as quite a large component. And that then brings us on to Safer Sephiroth, who appeared as the game's final boss. Safer Sephiroth would have to be faced at the end of a small boss medley that included Genova Synthesis and Bizarro Sephiroth. And despite featuring at the end of this gauntlet, it would still pack a punch through to a slew of devastating abilities. Some of these, such as Heartless Angel and Supernova, have since become iconic, and it's safe to say that anyone who wasn't over-prepared or over-leveled would struggle. But this encounter could be made even more difficult by accident. However, due to how the clauses needed to be triggered, it's quite possible that the player wouldn't even notice. The first factor, for example, will kick into gear dependent on how many characters had reached level 99. For each character to reach the maximum level, Safer Sephiroth would gain stat boosts across the board. This would include an additional 30,000 HP, as well as plus 2 attack, plus 20 defense, plus 5 magic attack, and plus 16 magic defense. And with this being per character, and there being quite a few characters, this could see a significant boost in the aforementioned stats. Further to this, if Knights of the Round had been used against Genova Synthesis, Safer Sephiroth would receive an additional 80,000 HP. Now these elements were no doubt designed to make Safer Sephiroth less of a pushover, as if Knights of the Round had been obtained, and even one character was at level 99, the encounter itself would not have been too much trouble. Still, it was a novel way for the developers to ensure Safer Sephiroth would at least be somewhat competitive against a beefed up party. As Business Division 1 sought to expand Final Fantasy XIII, they would introduce plenty of unique gameplay mechanics, and some of the most unorthodox could be found in the third installment, Lightning Returns. Perhaps the most notable was the Doomsday Clock mechanic, which saw progress mapped to an actual in-game clock. It would shape in-game events to be time-sensitive, leading to characters appearing at specific times, the shifting locations of Chaos Infusions, and even the appearance and condition of storyline bosses changing based on the day in which they were confronted. That last point then relates to the topic of this video, as one of the game's more significant bosses, Snowvilliers, could be made progressively more difficult, and this difficulty shift will be tied to the Doomsday Clock mechanic. Snow would serve as the central boss of the Yusnar main quest, where he would be fought at the Patron's Palace. Retaining his ice affinity from Final Fantasy XIII, Snow would have weakness to fire. However, depending on the day fought, Snow could in fact become much harder to defeat. In Lightning Returns, the quest structure would allow players the freedom to select which main quests to pursue on specific days. If players decided to delay the Yusnar main quests until day 6, they would face a more formidable Snowvilliers, aptly named Snowvilliers Plus, that would sport an adjusted character model. However, things could escalate even further when pushing the Yusnar main quests past day 10. This would elevate Snow even more, and as a reflection of the increased power, Snow would be renamed to Snowvilliers Plus. Further to this, Snow's character model would be changed in quite a severe manner, becoming visibly marred by his Seath transformation. In this maximised form, Snow would be a far more formidable opponent, boasting much higher HP and more powerful attacks. Additionally, he would become even more powerful when whittling him down to half HP, further bolstering his strength as well as speed. The Final Fantasy VII Remake served as a potent reimagining of the original game, which not only modernised certain aspects, but also served to enhance it in multiple ways relating to lore and gameplay. In light of this, innovations will be applied to many of the game's enemies, such as the common Hell House enemy being reworked into a single mightier boss, as well as the inclusion of boss fights against individual Turks. One of the more intriguing expansions was associated with the Airbuster boss, a notable boss from the original due to its difficulty and narrative cadence. In Remake, the Airbuster would be encountered during Chapter 7, but here the encounter was foreboding, and players were given the opportunity to manipulate the Airbuster's combat capabilities before the fight even happened. There would be 3 possible parts players could select to discard: Big Bombers, which could see the Airbuster administer devastating explosive attacks; AI programming cores, which would enable consistent use of the Airbuster's stun-inflicting finger beam attack; and M units, which would have no effect on the Airbuster's performance, but would grant them additional rewards upon the conclusion of the encounter. For those seeking a challenge, however, or those just who made unlucky choices, disposing of the M units would be the prime route towards ensuring the Airbuster still had regular access to its more punishing abilities, thus making the encounter much more difficult. With the ability to unleash devastating bomb attacks and stun the player more frequently, the Airbuster could be made into a much more significant opponent than intended. Last but not least, we arrive at the final entry on our list, Ultimatia. The final battle against Ultimatia has become one of the most iconic final boss encounters of all time, as she will possess some astonishing and powerful abilities that would include, but were not limited to, reducing the party to 1 HP, taking away entire spell stocks, and even eliminating Guardian forces. Considering she packed a solid punch, it was perhaps a bit alarming to realise she could be made into an even stronger adversary, and the factors that influence this will be found within character advancement mechanics. Final Fantasy VIII's character progression mechanics would depend on both the junction system and level advancement. However, of the two, junctioning would often outweigh the latter in value, as proper manipulation of the system could make for a much more powerful party rather than simply leveling up. However, there was another caveat that came in with leveling, and this would be the fact that enemy levels would scale off the player character levels. This meant that the higher the player levels, the stronger the enemies had the potential to be. This would affect many of the enemies found throughout Final Fantasy VIII, but perhaps the biggest consequence of this would be that the scaling didn't just apply to random encounters, but bosses as well, and Ultimatia would be one of the biggest benefactors outside of the likes of a mega weapon. The only saving grace was that Ultimatia's stat scaling would stop at level 65. Even still, in Griever form, Ultimatia would gain access to stronger spells as more levels were obtained, and when looking at the final form, the level 65 iteration would have an additional 60,000 HP with a boost of 30 magic points when compared to the level 50 iteration. And with that, they were 7 bosses encountered across the Final Fantasy franchise that could be made even harder by accident, or accidentally on purpose. How many of these did you trigger? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to give us a like and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Adam Aguilara, Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Galcian Kujata, Justin Dent, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.